Next, a look at the intersection of religion and politics from the American Revolution through modern times. The Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis partnered with Southern Methodist University's Center for Presidential History, hosting this event in November. This portion is about 90 minutes.
Well, my name is Brian Franklin, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. I welcome you all to our conference as well, which promises to be a very fascinating and enlightening time for all of us. I have the privilege of introducing our first panel of guests for the day, focusing on the topic of faith and modern politics. First, we will hear from Dr. Carte Engel, Associate Professor of Religious Studies here at SMU. She is the author of Religion and Prophet, Moravians in Early America, which was awarded the Dale Brown Award for Outstanding Scholarship in Anabaptist and Pietist Studies. She has been a fellow at the American Council of Learned Societies, the American Philosophical Society, and the Center for Study of Religion at Princeton University. Her current project, The Cause of True Religion, investigates the consequences of the American Revolution for transatlantic Protestant networks in North America, Britain, and Europe. Her presentation today is entitled The Founding Fathers in Modern America. Our second panelist is Darren Dochuk. Dr. Dochuk is Associate Professor in the Department of History and Associate Professor in the Humanities in the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. In 2011, Professor Dochuk published From Bible Belt to Sun Belt, Plain Folk Religion, Grassroots Politics, and the Rise of Evangelical Conservatism, a book which won a host of awards, including the American Historical Association's John Dunning Book Prize for Outstanding Historical Writing on any subject in U.S. history. Dochuk is currently working on a book tentatively titled Anointed with Oil, God and Black Gold in Modern America. His presentation today, Crude Awakenings in the Age of Oil, arises from this project. Our third panelist is Dr. Spencer Fluhman, Associate Professor of History at Brigham Young University. He has held fellowships from the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture and the Joseph Fielding Smith Institute for Latter-day Saints History. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Journal of Religion and Society, Journal of Mormon History, and BYU Studies Quarterly. His book, A Peculiar People, Anti-Mormonism and the Making of Religion in 19th Century America, was published in 2012 and won the 2013 Mormon History Association's Best First Book Award. Dr. Fluhman's presentation today is entitled Never-Ending Mormon Moments. Our fourth and final presentation for this panel comes from Dr. Charles Irons, Associate Professor of History and Chair of the Department of History and Geography at Elon University in Elon, North Carolina. His first book is entitled The Origins of Pro-Slavery Christianity, White and Black Evangelicals in Colonial and Antebellum Virginia. His work has appeared in the Journal of Southern Religion, the American Baptist Quarterly, and more than a dozen other books and journals. His current research is on the complicated process through which black churchgoers withdrew from white-controlled congregations following the Civil War. And his topic today is Religion and the Outsider Candidates. Allow me to offer a quick note here about our process for this session and our sessions today. Each of our guests, in turn, will give their presentations one after the other without taking much of a break in between. And after these four presentations, the moderator, in this case, me, will open the floor to you, the audience, to be able to ask questions or make comments, which you can direct at a particular panelist or at the group in general. We welcome these comments, we welcome these questions, and we encourage you to participate with us. Well, it is now thankfully time for me to step aside and let others speak more intelligently about faith and modern politics. So let's welcome together our first guest, Dr. Carte Engel.
Thank you, Brian, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today and joining us, especially for this first session so early in the morning. It's such a pleasure to see so many distinguished scholars and friends here in the audience today and also on the panel, so welcome all. So what I'm going to talk about today is a conservative Christian reading of the American Revolution and how that influences modern politics. This is certainly a topic that's been in the press lately. In September and October of this year, both Colorado and Texas saw very public and very political struggles over the proper teaching of the nation's history. The College Board, a private organization that administers the widely used advanced placement tests used in high schools, released new guidelines for AP US history. Conservative pundits accuse the new curriculum of promoting among our students a disdain for American principles and a lack of knowledge of major American achievements. And those are the words of a member of the Texas State Board of Education. Explicit mentions of religion in the discussions about the AP US history standards were mostly relegated to the fringes, creating the impression of a secular debate. But if we look into the complaints against the curriculum, we can find strong resonances of what is, I would like to suggest, a religious practice shared by many conservative Christians. The active and repeated study of the nation's founding through a form of historical reasoning derived from reading Scripture has produced a unique, identifiable, and exclusive narrative of U.S. history that, stripped of its religious connotations, influences public life and public debate through discussions like that over the AP U.S. history curriculum. Before I get started, I want to give just a couple caveats. The first is that conservative Christians are in no way alone in their interest in the founding era. Obviously, through trends recently called founder chic, many Americans have been very, very interested in the process of the Revolutionary War, and especially in the lives of the founders, who are seen as some of the greatest and obviously most influential Americans. So when conservative Christians have created their reading of the American Revolution, they're participating in a larger national conversation on the subject. Second, I want to be careful about how I'm using the word Christian. Obviously, American Christians are an extraordinarily diverse and broad group of Americans, numerically, politically, theologically. What I'm focusing on today is a vocal and important subset of that group. Many Christians who want to pursue interest in the founding era can, through sites that are endorsed by various evangelical organizations or various other Christian organizations, find their way to academic scholarship, and certainly Christian historians in particular have played a very active role in mediating between the academic community and Christian interest in the subject. So I don't want to minimize those very important trends. But what I'd like to focus on today is a very vocal and distinctive reading of the American Revolution that coexists with these other trends. Now, many biblically minded Protestants use the concept of a harmonious reading to the entirety of Scripture in order to manage passages that would otherwise be difficult or contradictory. The concept that Scripture interprets Scripture suggests that, in the words of megachurch pastor Rick Warren, the Bible is its own best commentary, a point he lists as second among 6 principles for interpreting Scripture. The concept is repeated widely in various guides for understanding that complex text, and it's linked to the Protestant concept of sola scriptura, or by Scripture alone. If the Bible is the one sole source of truth, then it must provide all the tools necessary for its own interpretation, and the overall meanings of the entire text must harmonize. The idea that Scripture interprets Scripture is a method of historical analysis as well as a form of textual reading. Some moments, events, and passages of the Bible are far more important than others to understanding the principles of the whole. The interpreter determines what these are through his or her knowledge of both the whole and the principles. Applying this strategy to a relatively recent moment in history, like the American Revolution, requires a 2-step process. First, the knowledgeable writer introduces the era with a clear sense of its guiding meaning. Then, with that meaning in mind, the practice of reading the founding era can be undertaken. And I'd like to suggest today that the practice of interpreting the American founding as having consistent and identifiable principles transforms both the purpose of learning about history and the kinds of evidence used, and furthermore, that by studying the past with the same practices they use to study the Bible, conservative Christians make reading the American Revolution a religious act. Now, these readings of the American Revolution begin and end with principles, not just in interpretation, but usually in structure. The American Patriot's Bible, published by Thomas Nelson Press in 2009, begins with the 7 principles of the Judeo-Christian ethic, which readers are told were the core beliefs of our nation's founding fathers. When those men, quote, gave us documents such as the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and others, they had to lean upon a common understanding of law, government, social order, and morality, end quote. It's not necessary for the importance of these principles that they be uniformly representative of the revolutionary public opinion, or even the founders, as the authors are quick to point out. The important element is that they are guiding principles. The authors of this text continue, whether each of the founding fathers was a Christian is not the issue. Their writings, their statements, and their votes evidence that the majority of them embrace these great principles as the basis for a civilized nation. As might be expected, pedagogical texts forefront principles in equally stark ways. America's Providential History, written by Mark Balliol and Stephen K. McDowell in 1989, has its list of 7 principles of liberty in the conclusion. The list is not original to Balliol and McDowell, but rather is taken from a widely cited and circulated work by Rosalie Slater, Teaching and Learning Americans Christian History. Now, if we try to sum up the principles that appear across all of these different texts and distill them into a common core, conservative Christians generally agree that the principles, the true meanings, lessons, and motivators of the founding era were a high level of Protestant devotion and strong Protestant institutions, God's covenant with the American people, the powerful flowering of an undefined liberty, depending on the writer, this can be either personal liberty or economic liberty, and the faithfulness of the founding fathers. Because they motivated the canonical event of the American Revolution, they must be applicable to public life today. So how does the American Revolution look when viewed through these principles? What is the history of the era? The dominant trait that must be noted first is that it is non-chronological. Guided by a focus on principle, conservative Christian historians are generally more comfortable writing in a thematic or a topical vein rather than using a narrative or chronological approach. Thus, Peter Lilbach's massive biography of George Washington, for example, discusses the early life of George Washington, but then moves through Washington as he appeared in a series of roles in a topical fashion, such as low churchman, vestryman, or soldier. Lilbach's primary goal here is to focus on Washington's character as it appeared in different situations, but the consequence is to take the man out of time. Michael Novak, in his book On Two Wings, uses a similar strategy when he frames, and this is his heading for the substantial section in the book, 10 Questions About the Founding. And David Barton's highly influential Wall Builder website avoids narrative in favor of narrow topical question and answers that move seamlessly between different time periods. Despite this non-narrative approach, the key moments in the Christian reading of the Revolution can be teased out. The story begins with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Indeed, the founding of Plymouth becomes the first act in the Revolutionary War. The narrative then leapfrogs to the Americans' conflict with Great Britain, but it focuses on 2 key points specifically: the importance of public prayer and then the personal piety of particular leaders. The crisis endured by Washington's forces at Valley Forge, because it brings these 2 different trends together, is the pivotal moment in the narrative. From that terrible winter in 1777 and 78, writers turn quickly to the Revolution's fulfillment in the Constitution almost 10 years later, or more frequently to topically organized analyses of the guiding principles. The prominence of the Puritans to the American founding emerges from many sources. America's Providential History, a textbook for homeschoolers, has a chapter entitled The Pilgrims, a Model of Christian Character. The following chapter then covers the founding of all 13 colonies in at least some detail, but concludes with a summary section titled Biblical Reformation in Civil Government that clarifies the preceding confusion of colonial origins. We can see a consistent Christian dominance in the settlement of every single colony, the authors claim. The Puritans then provide their best evidence. A joint statement made by all the northern colonies in the New England Confederation of 1643 would just as well have been made by all 13 colonies, they claim.
It stated, "We all came into these parts of America with one and the same end and aim, namely to advance the kingdom of our Lord Jesus Christ and to enjoy the liberties of the gospel in purity and peace. Civil government is a reflection of church government," the writers explain, implying by this assertion that this is the meaning of the entire colonial era. The Revolutionary War functions as a climax rather than as a primary narrative in Peter Marshall and David Manuel's enormously influential 1977 work, The Light and the Glory, as its authors use roughly half of their pages to describe the Pilgrims and the Puritans. The story regularly shifts in time between the author's search for meaning in the present and a richly elaborated narrative, including details such as the color of the wake behind the Mayflower, the facial expressions of historical figures, and even fictionalized dialogue. The reader is invited to lose herself in the drama of the past, and yet reminded that the purpose of the reading is to discern the meanings of monumentally important events. This continual telescoping between past and present, between knowable and unknowable details, creates highly readable prose, but it also obscures the temporal elision between the early 17th century and the late 18th. Describing the Mayflower Compact, Marshall and Manuel provide a perfect example of how using principle to interpret history alters the framing and texture of events. The authors write that the Pilgrims drafted a document that was pragmatic, realistic, and expedient. Yet it also, quote, embodied the same principles of equality in government by consent of the governed, which would become the cornerstones of American democracy. This analysis is then immediately amended with a parenthetical reaching far further back into history, as the authors assert that the true origin of the Compact's principles can be found with the ancient Hebrews, before skating forward in time to quote the Declaration of Independence's opening lines. In the space of one page, the authors demonstrate the centrality of the Pilgrims' expedient document to a history that stretches from biblical times, then through the enduring influence of Jefferson's words, up to our present. Interestingly, the document itself and the question of what specifically is meant by principles of equality amidst language that stresses submission, obedience, and the sovereignty of the king is not parsed. The exegetical point has already been made, and I have to say reading this kind of text is really quite exhilarating as the author is invited to make comparisons between widely disparate moments in time and widely different documents that resonate quite deeply. But your attention is forced to connecting the principles between these different moments rather than invited to engage in any more plodding narrative of history. How is this particular document framed within its particular moment? We can see this process again if we look to where the narratives go next. From the Puritans, we jump to the war years of the Revolution. And I should note that this means that we often jump over the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence, which of course is a sacred text, is then treated separately in a topical fashion rather than situated in its immediate pragmatic context of grappling with the complexities of making the step of separating from England. The war years have two primary characteristics. First, a culture that valued public prayer and its clergy, and second, leaders who valiantly and successfully struggled as men to live up to the great responsibilities God had given them. Michael Novak, in his On Two Wings, lists 7 events that revealed the power of the second wing. And for Novak, the first wing is liberty and the second wing is humble faith. Each is a demonstration of public observations of Christianity that shows, in Novak's argument, that faith was a primary motivator of the American Revolution. Now, for this analysis to work, one must remember that what is being motivated is not specific historical action, such as anger over the Massachusetts Port Act or frustration with an occupying army, but rather the American founding in its greatest terms. Values, like principles, become actors in history. Now, in his declaration, Novak actually lists the Declaration of Independence as one of his events that show faith in the founding era, and he argues that the Declaration of Independence is itself a prayer, and he makes this argument by telescoping back to the Mayflower Compact, and so doing the exact same connecting that Manuel and Marshall had done in the other direction, starting with the Mayflower Compact and jumping forward. So the various elements of the canon are then continually reinforced through the repeated appearance. The second characteristic of the war years is the piety of the nation's leadership. George Washington, the ultimate founder, offers perfect material for this narrative because he was intentionally silent on most subjects of religion. The American Patriot's Bible has a brief section discussing Washington's character, but rather than offer examples of his own words, the authors focus on the dilemma of how a man of such greatness can even be known, including glowing retellings from after his death. Having constructed a devout and sober leader in Washington, Valley Forge, interpreted as the Great Crisis, becomes the central moment of the Revolutionary era. It brings together the character lessons embedded in the teaching about Washington, the importance of prayer, the key role of faith through difficult times. Marshall and Manuel and countless other retellers recount an apocryphal story, familiar to many Americans, of Washington bowing his head in prayer at Valley Forge. Though the great man sought privacy, he reportedly was seen by a neighboring Quaker who then spread the word. The story of the general kneeling in the snow in Valley Forge is of a man who, in a time of crisis, turned to his faith and his Bible to act decisively. It has led to some of the most widely reproduced artistic images of the Revolutionary era, expressing the core meaning of the nation's defining moment for many Americans, both within the conservative Christian community and then also beyond it as well. And that core meaning is that in this case, a nation was united in a time of trial behind a Christian leader who looked to God. By retelling the story, Christians assert the importance of that ideal to our own era, and with these truths established, the nation is founded. After Valley Forge, after Washington prays at Valley Forge, we actually have very little further narrative of what happens in the Revolutionary era. At this point, the war ends, and we jump usually to topical reframings of the Constitution or of the application of the principles that have been elaborated to the present. So what's left out? Of course, many of the complicated moments of the Revolutionary era are left out. The most obvious one is slavery. The substantial portion of the American population that was not on board with the Patriot movement, also missing. But there are other elements of the popular imagination of the American Revolutionary era that are also left out of this retelling that make the Christian narrative of the era particularly distinctive. The Boston Tea Party, Washington crossing the Delaware, all of the battles. These are missing from the telling because they don't fit within the guiding principles within the way that these authors want to promote. The Constitutional Convention and the ratification process. This last one I think is often, when I hear academic historians talk about the founding era and how it appears in popular imagination, this one is particularly surprising because the ratification process probably provides the best evidence of Christian voices seeking to shape a Christian nation, but that piece of the story is left out. These omissions are not a problem, however, because the meaning of the era is clear, transcendent, and timeless, and indeed, as all true scriptures must be. Conservative Christians have canonized the founding era, and their historians have described it as a period replete with moral meaning and divine inspiration. The result is a kind of historical reading that explicitly and strategically minimizes not only conflict, but indeed sequential historical process in favor of positive and useful meaning. The principles of the founding era and their obvious applicability to the present, and here we should think of, in the present tense, the importance of devout Christian leaders, the prominent role for clergy in public life, a love of liberty, and a unified nation favored by God. The current applicability of these principles provide the purpose for studying the era, and until they are universally embraced, they also provide the need to repeatedly study and contemplate the era. The purpose is not to gain knowledge, but to bring about prayerful change. The ritual and repetitive circularity of this process is no more problematic than when it is applied to devotional reading of Christian scripture. This is history as religious practice, as much as it is religion as a political act. And the elision between the two provides an important intertwining of the religious and political in the early 21st century. Thank you.
Good morning. Good to see you. I'm going to take a few minutes and talk about pipelines and Protestants, just a few of those in these parts. In early 2012, amid the unprecedented heat of one of the strangest springs in history, Barack Obama set out for Oklahoma to jumpstart an energy tour. The politician had work to do, win re-election, and seemed unfazed by the blistering temperatures and torrential storms that made March feel like July. And so, at a rally in Cushing, Oklahoma, Obama brushed over weather and talked energy instead. Flanked by steel pipes, he laid out his plans for America's future. First came a tribute to folks who drilled the nation's crude, then an appeal to their vote. Over the last 3 years, I've directed my administration to open up millions of acres for gas and oil exploration across 23 different states. We're opening up more than 75% of our potential oil resources offshore. We've quadrupled the number of operating rigs to a record high. We've added enough new pipeline to encircle the earth and then some. Obama's statement for, as he called it, an all-of-the-above energy strategy came last. The plan was fourfold: more jobs for hardworking Americans, more oil development and infrastructure with government's assist, more drive towards renewable energy and care of the environment, and more domestic production and less dependency on foreign oil. We've got to have a vision for the future, he implored. That's what America has always been about. That's how we have to think about energy. God bless you. God bless the United States of America. Now, Obama's faithful cheered his sweeping promises for more. Who wouldn't? Yet, as policy, the speech clanged with a few incongruities. Could Americans truly get more of everything with little cost? How might an open-ended energy policy benefit the Earth? Or reverse global warming, whose effect Obama's overheated listeners were sweating out? Republican and Democratic naysayers questioned the president's speech and pondered whether all of the above would result in none of the above results. Now, to be fair, Obama's talk was boilerplate, designed to rally troops, yet his speech also illustrates tentative thinking. When he won the Democratic primaries in 2008, he predicted that in his administration, the rise of the oceans will begin to slow and the planet begin to heal. Yet in Cushing, amid evidences of rising waters and a wounded planet, he preferred to boast about pipelines encircling the Earth. His broader record further reveals uncertainty. In the struggle over TransCanada's Keystone Pipeline, for instance, which inspired his Oklahoma visit, he has spoken for and against the enterprise, urged construction in some sections, delayed in others, paused for environmental reassessment, and infuriated activists and Canadians, tough to do, with his indecision. The president, one can say, has been trapped repeatedly in the conundrums of energy politics. But it's too simple to highlight the disjointedness of Obama's agenda, for his conundrums are products of profoundly complex circumstances. Defying neat partisan categories, irreducible to culture war, blue-red divides, energy politics are knotty, drawing into collision multiple ideals. No simple matter of opposed self-interests. In other words, energy politics are totalizing and existential, even eschatological. It has always been that way, especially with oil, my focus for today. Since the dawn of their oil age, Americans have viewed the black stuff as more than a source of fuel. It has defined their diet and sent them to war, allowed regions to flourish, others to fall, generated anxiety about America's place in this world and its people's prospects in the next. So considering oil's ultimate significance, it's no far reach to conclude that present-day energy politics in which Obama is embroiled carry religious weight. This is indeed what I would like to conclude, what I would like us to conclude today, that our struggles over pipelines also represent a clash of competing carbon gospels stemming from particularities of place, their renderings in sacred terms, and the disjunctive histories and visions of the future that frame their political possibilities. So in order to nudge us to this conclusion, I'm going to glance just very briefly, I think, at four gospels evidenced in Obama's speech, the 4 points that I just highlighted, all of which are pressing on Obama's current struggles with the Keystone debate. Highlight briefly their awakening, the moment at which this new thinking, a new imagination about pipelines and oil emerged, and mention a few prophets who set these in motion, and then I'll pause at the end for some fuller appreciation of the president's dilemma. First Crude awakening, that which kind of stimulated a protest against the petrol machine in defense of possessive individualism. At the heart of Obama's predicament is a quest to help petroleum's underclass, landholders, oil patch workers, and average citizens in close proximity to drill sites and pipelines whose cries for access to the economic promises of oil and protection from overbearing oil companies reverberate with a familiar populist beat. And here again, if you look at recent struggles over the pipeline in the Dakotas, we see ranchers joining Native Americans to protest the way in which land is being taken from them. This is combined with anxiety over jobs, just how many jobs will or will not be created by the pipeline. These entwined concerns, bringing together kind of interesting and curious coalitions of activists, have made oil patch locals of all political stripes, ranchers, Native Americans, a hesitant majority, convinced of only two things: that oil companies cannot be trusted to care for the land and labor pools they seek to tap, and that local people deserve the fruits of the resource development that's disrupting their soil. In this rhetoric, they echo a disquiet that has reverberated for over a century, which takes us back to the first crude awakening in the early 20th century, which raised this disquiet and created an intending gospel of protest against petrocapitalism. It was in the early 1900s that Americans came to terms with their energy revolution and its first victims. And of course, as we know, those who have read history textbooks, the first victims were those rank and file producers and locals who struggled under the weight of John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil. Now, a devout Baptist, Rockefeller was evangelical in his view of oil. Besides deeming his extraction of crude providential, he believed that his corporate ventures were themselves acts of redemption designed to rescue the oil business from chaos. As Ron Chernow writes, this Christian certainty gave him a courageous persistence and capacity to think in strategic terms, but also a messianic self-righteousness and contempt for those short-sighted mortals who made the mistake of standing in his way. The mortals, of course, saw him differently, clawed back with moral critique. And their champion was Ida Tarbell, a journalist whose name we all recognize from textbooks as the woman who destroyed the Standard Trust. But what is less appreciated is the degree to which, in this moment, Tarbell's actions grew out of her wrestling with God and the ghosts of her youth. And I don't have time to walk us through her history of a fascinating biography. Someone who was raised in Western Pennsylvania in oil country, to Methodist parents, someone who took her Methodist faith quite seriously. She, in fact, was very much part of the Chautauqua movement, which was located just an hour away in New York. And it's through her experiences in Western Pennsylvania. Her father was an oilman whose spirit was crushed by the Rockefeller machine. She started to look at journalism as a possibility to combine her faith, her familial history, and work that into a stinging critique of Standard Oil. We know the rest of the story. By 1904, she publishes The History of Standard Oil, which identifies Rockefeller really as the man who symbolized all that's wrong in national life at that moment. And then the ultimate conclusion to this is the Supreme Court's ruling of 1911, which dismantled Standard Oil. The other legacy here, though, the one that she would bequest to future generations of oil's rank and file, was, again, a doctrine of pristine or possessive capitalism. When fighting Rockefeller, Tarbell stressed the innately pure qualities of the local patch in which she grew up. Hers was not a condemnation of petrocapitalism, but a petition to clean it up. Life ran swift and ruddy and joyous in these men, she writes glowingly of men like her father. They looked forward with all the eagerness of the young who have just learned their powers to the years of struggle. They would meet their own needs. There was nothing they did not hope and dare. Tarbell's faith in oil's first generation mirrored her belief in the goodness of her church and human ability to better society through smart application of biblical principles. It also matched her conviction that petrocapitalism had to remain egalitarian if it were to thrive. Free competition was her Eden, and life outside it could not help but be sinful. She theologized oil's land and labor too. Shaped by her readings in Christian socialism, she came to understand the struggle with Standard as one to protect the value of small-scale production by individual laborers. She would write, "God gave man the land, but man has to use his hand and brain in its cultivation before he can feed and clothe and shelter himself. It is the partnership of the two, land and labor, which produces wealth." Because of Rockefeller, she lamented, labor had been made dependent on capital by capital's theft of the land which God gave to all. So though she couldn't imagine it at the time, her countering ethic of individualism would endure among men and women like her parents for generations to come. This leads to a second and third crude awakenings that I'll just glance over briefly. Standard, of course, was not defeated ultimately totally by Tarbell and the Supreme Court, fractured into 34 different companies that in fact benefited from the diversification. In the 1930s and 1940s, it's in this moment of chaos in East Texas where a new oil boom is bringing kind of overproduction to the awareness of the federal government that the New Deal is deciding to work with major companies to create some sense of order in the fields. Here, the standards of New Jersey, California, New York are going to team up with Harold Ickes, the Secretary of the Interior in the 1930s and 40s, to bring order to the fields. Ickes, along with others at this moment, like Eddy and Luce, are going to frame a new vision, what I would call a civil religion of crude in the mid-20th century, in which government working with major oil companies could encourage expansion of both Christendom and a gentler kind of democratic oil kingdom to the rest of the world. William Eddy was one of the spokespersons of this vision, writes in 1940 as he was trying to open up Saudi Arabia for Aramco, Standard of California, quote, "We who believe in Christendom serve the only totalitarian king, need to cover ourselves with tolerance, reverence, and charity, and then wherever we walk, we shall find ourselves on holy ground." 3 years later, as a consultant for California Standard, he was surveying Arabia for crude. 5 years later, brokering a deal between Saudi's king and America's president based on in his mind, a mutual trust. His was a firm belief shared by Ickes that an ecumenical, big liberal religion wedded to major oil, itself ecumenical, could usher humanity into a new age. And the religious fervor behind this message has abated, yet as witnessed, I think, in Obama's Cushing speech, its assumptions about Washington's dominion over petrol reserves, bringing the federal government actually into the regulatory position that we see today. Obama's gesture to petroleum's benevolence and a closing ecumenical plea for God's blessing, I think we see the remnants of the second crude awakening today. A third awakening really follows chronologically in the 50s and 70s, and this is the rise of the wildcat oilmen we are familiar with here in Texas, of course. Wildcat imperative was a response defensive to what Harold Ickes and the American government was doing, partnering major oil companies with Washington to open up foreign fields. It was defensive in the sense that independent oil producers here in the Southwest especially felt that their vision of America, their vision of their industry was being challenged. A number of prophets kind of stepped up at this moment to champion the rule of capture of the wildcatter, a very evangelical ideology, if you will. One of them was Robert Kerr, a more hopeful, optimistic, positive kind of wildcatter, if you will. As Oklahoma's governor and senator in the 1940s and 50s, he labored to meet independent oil's needs and carried the mantle for the dispossessed, albeit a wealthy dispossessed, working all of his connections to give small producers the protections they deserved. What's interesting here, too, is how Kerr, a very prominent Southern Baptist, was able to fold his politics and his interests in the protection of independent oilmen with his faith in the ability of individuals to approach Scripture and Christ on their own terms, much as the same way they approached subsurface minerals. There was also a harder edge to this wildcat Christianity that emerged in the 70s, connecting the fear of peak oil, the fear that America was losing its ability to control its most valued resource, losing that to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia. That took the form of premillennialist dispensationalism. Here, prophets like John Walvoord, a theologian based here at Dallas, combined the fears of peak oil with end times thinking that the end was nigh and that America had lost its ability to prepare for the end times in the right manner. Why? Because the federal government and major oil companies, of course, had stolen their authority and power. Brings us to the fourth crude awakening, finally, and this is the one that we are dealing with today, a carbon-free gospel, if you will. Despite his sweeping promises at Cushing, Obama failed to convince leaders of the current awakening, again, whose gospel is carbon-free. It makes no sense at all. Speaking of Obama's referencing of improving the environment and renewable energy sources, drilling everywhere you can and then putting up a solar panel is like drinking 6 martinis and then topping them off with a vitamin water. You're still drunk. You just have your day's full allotment of C and D. So the testiest of Obama's naysayers are also his one-time champions. Those leading this kind of fourth crude awakening are environmental activists whose faith in reform was bolstered by Obama's stirring speech during the 2008 Democratic National Convention, but whose trust has been battered since. Among them, several voices stand out, but no one is more eloquent or earnest than Bill McKibben, who is head of 350.org and author of some of the most popular Jeremiads against global warming. McKibben became an author activist and then just an activist in 2011 just as the Keystone Crisis was emerging in his mind, the Keystone Crisis. And since then, of course, as we know, has led marches through Washington, through New York City just a month ago. With each step forward as an activist, McKibben has been more deliberate in reaching back into the repositories of Scripture and back to the land's spirituality. In a way, his view of oil as the ultimate moral test for humanity mirrors that of his muckraking predecessor, Ida Tarbell, with whom he shares his Methodism and a theological eclecticism that blends love of the Bible with awe of nature's mysteries and a transcendent view of terrestrial things. Through his writings, through his activism, he has managed to stir up a new constituency of activists, I think a very interesting one, young evangelicals aligned with sojourners, many of them coming from the oil patch itself, including from Texas. Oil patch Pentecostal and Baptist youth have journeyed to Washington to stand with McKibben, with nuns, Mennonites, Quakers, ranchers, and indigenous communities in opposition to the Keystone. In other isolated moments, they have traveled to Nebraska and Texas to chain themselves to bulldozers, prey on pipe, and use faith to subvert oil's order. And in all of this, they see this as a great revival brewing of the kind witnessed in the 19th century, led by Charles Finney. McKibben would disagree with the way in which zealous evangelical young people are still looking for the next revival. In his estimation, the fires of revival are already burning bright. So Barack Obama, you might say, also senses the heat of these 4 revivals, these 4 awakenings. Unlike McKibben's, however, his charge is manifold, living with the legacy of several crude awakenings, encountering carbon gospels on multiple sides. His is a tough task that demands a careful sorting out, which is why his all-of-the-above energy policy has been a path of some convenience, and why his energy dilemma could very well be his successor's too. But that's a misleading conclusion as well, because change is surely coming. Keystone's final decisions are impending, its destiny and the consequences for people on the plains to be decided soon. All the more it seems now that pipeline-supporting Republicans have taken control of the Senate. According to several Washington insiders and pundits, the Keystone was seen as the big winner on Tuesday and one of the most heralded victories in GOP circles. And of course, Republican leaders have already promised to make the pipeline a priority, with the goal of sending the president a bill to authorize its completion and daring him to veto it. Whether lost or won, the Keystone is only the tip of mounting warfare between multiple parties, all of which hold deep convictions about the proper place of oil and energy in our new millennium. McKibben's carbon-free campaign may end up losing the Keystone fight. Wildcatters may win, but his movement for reform is forcing many North Americans to a place of reckoning where carbon emissions, global warming, and earth care are concerned. The reckoning has already produced surprising results and more curious evidences of new directions. Even as the Koch brothers and their lobby for pipeline-friendly initiatives have raised the ire of American liberals, in Alberta, home to the oil sands, it's green salvationist billionaires, borrowing from a Canadian journalist, who seem threatening to the order. Among the salvationist billionaires of whom the angry Canadians speak are the Rockefellers and the Pews, whose foundations are leading a wider anti-tar sands campaign, and in the case of the former, divesting their oil holdings following the lead of McKibben's organization. Rockefellers abandoning petroleum, Pews shunning the Canadian oil sands, the very venture they created in the 1950s. Such are the striking signs of revolution that would surprise Ida Tarbell and worry beyond measure the likes of John Walford. We historians, of course, shouldn't be too surprised. Change is what we write about, so too contingency and the fleetingness of tidy analytical categories. Even a quick glance at these four turns in the life of 20th and 21st century oil should remind us of that. Here, in the first place, we're privy to a host of characters and dynamics that don't necessarily line up with our conventions of religious and political history. The spiritual calamity of oil in these moments created flashes of insurgence that really shattered familiar binaries, conservative, liberal, sacred, secular, evangelical, non-evangelical, and bound uncommon faith partners along with the non-religious together behind shared ethics of place, capital, labor, and custodianship over Earth's most valued treasure. The degree to which these insurgencies will disrupt our familiar narratives and categories and produce major religious political realignments going forward is a question yet to be answered. What is striking, finally, is the way in which those locking arms over pipelines in protest have kind of created a transcendent ambition and worry for many Americans over the issue of oil. We shortchange our histories of modern America when we don't calculate the deep structures of meaning that those living in oil-rich zones ascribe to their labor on and below the land and measure the length to which they will go politically to protect their rights to these encounters. We also fall short by not allowing for dense complexities in the relationship. No conspiracy of interest, big oil versus the people. Oil, we've seen, has a way of eliciting divergent imaginations. For Rockefeller, it was industrial America's lifeblood. For Tarbell, oil also meant the excrement of the devil. And notions of work and family, patterns of time, and the nation's proper engagement with the world. It is in the contestation within oil culture that we can identify the prompts for some of America's most profound political and religious turns. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. In the 2012 presidential election, both candidates fastidiously avoided mention of Mr. Romney's religion. Though banked and cooled by both campaigns, religion nevertheless spilled out hot everywhere. The Obama campaign fumed when Romney, in a nod to Protestant evangelicals, told Sean Hannity in February 2012 that Mr. Obama wanted to make America, quote, a less Christian nation. Asked about the statement, Romney said he wasn't familiar with what he said, but, quote, I stand by what I said, whatever it was. Tellingly, even with such non-statements about faith in the air, neither could quite take Mormonism head on. Those official silences stood in tension with a wave of media obsession that conjured a Mormon moment, so-called, that filled periodicals and news programs with profiles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its members. Is there a relationship between those ubiquitous media discoveries of Mormonism and the political silences surrounding it? This morning, I contend that the specific form that American engagement with Mormonism has long taken, that of the exposé, encourages reflection within the study of religion and politics about the meanings of religious secrecy. What can we say about the repeated keeping and disclosing of Mormon secrets? Or put more crassly, what does it mean that Americans have long demanded that Mr. Romney account for his underwear? Journalists in 2012 were thrust into the basic paradox of this history. Is Mormonism an exotic creation with strange rituals and secretive patriarchs? Or is it the quintessentially American religion, a patriotic, if bland, church extolling large families and capitalist achievement? In part, it is Mormonism's liminality that has marked it for such continuing political controversy. It's seen as both Christian and not quite Christian, both as a religion and somehow more, or is it less than one? Today, I offer secrecy as a key fulcrum for that liminality. Mormonism's secrets have thus helped constitute it as a classificatory problem for Americans and for scholars alike, but at the same time, Mormon secrets have helped make a distinctive Mormon people possible. Seen in this light, the consequential effects of secrecy give us more than additional details to round out a religion's historical portrait. Rather, they provide us the gritty mechanics of power itself, how it is constituted and contested. And since Mormonism's stubborn concealment impulses run right into the teeth of our scholarly and democratic projects, they beg important questions of both American politics and those of us who study them. Many religious traditions acknowledge some kind of hidden knowledge, just as sacred space can enclose secrets and mark membership in a Pueblo Kiva or in Mecca. So it has been with the Mormon temple's spatial restrictions. But especially during periods of social or political strain, religious secrets can signal danger. This was true of earliest Christianity, where the Disciplina Arcani kept the faith's mysteries from non-believers and initiates alike, but also drew allegations of subversion. In the American context, similar dangers were perceived in the 19th century Mormons, with Roman Catholics, in the 20th century with black sects such as the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, and with the Church of Scientology after World War II, and with Muslims after September 11th, 2001. Mormonism may seem to be an especially secretive faith, but it did not emerge that way. The historical, almost accidental presence of secrecy in early Mormonism blossomed as the tradition entered a generative second stage in the 1840s, when church leaders put secrecy at the church's administrative and sacramental core. Political strategies, polygamous marriages, elaborate temple rituals. By 1850, Mormonism teemed with secrets. Through this robust but hidden substratum, Mormons redefined Christianity, family, sexuality, time, and human bodies themselves. Indeed, where Mormon conceptions of space and time had earlier worked on the access of a holy city and a millenarian countdown, the 1840s innovations set the project on a new footing. The Mormon temple had functioned as the axis mundi for the millennial city, but now the saints' own bodies formed the Holy of Holies within the sacred spaces. Appropriately, Mormons both donned ceremonial clothing for the rites and wore special underclothing thereafter. Mormons could scarcely jettison their secret things without pulling the foundations out from under some substantial ritual and theological structures. It is not surprising, then, that ex-Mormons have long known exactly how to leave or exactly where to strike. The secrets were just waiting to be exposed. Secrecy has thus functioned as a lever for Mormon identity, marking passageways both into and out of the religion's beating heart. Mormons prize their pioneer-era temples for their rough-hewn beauty and the sun-baked powers of will that have called them up from the desert floor. But given the history I'm narrating here, their similarities of form speak an altogether different sermon. They are, after all, each castles. As citadels of the secrets, they call up defiance, resistance, and entrenchment. Mormons soon understood their relationship to outsiders as one of colonization, and the temples seemed to mark a line in the Great Basin sand. Modern Mormon moments have accordingly followed a basic recipe with stunning regularity. What emerges from the cycle of secret keeping and expose is a cultural script, an American political ritual that has continued unabated to our time. Time permits consideration of some of the most memorable iterations, but only in brief. 1890. As the 1880s anti-polygamy crusade wreaked havoc throughout Mormondom, the LDS hierarchy made gradual accommodations to put off the seemingly inevitable. With 1,300 Mormons imprisoned, many more disenfranchised, and church property in federal hands, still they hoped for a workable middle way. Only when back-channel communications warned that the temples, too, would be subject to federal seizure did the great accommodation come. The U.S. Secretary of Interior sent word in August of 1890 that he would not abide the earlier gentleman's agreement sparing the LDS temples. And the church president's famed polygamy manifesto ending the practice came just days, not weeks, later. Even polygamy, which Mormons had sworn could not be given up without wrecking everything, turned out to be expendable when compared with the maintenance of the sacred places. 1904. Some LDS leaders sustained a program of secret polygamy in the decade and a half following official disavowal, some 300 secret marriages at least, in expectation of Christ's vindicating return, or short of that, a more congenial Supreme Court. But quiet resistance went hand in hand with public integration strategies at the same time, including Utah's election of a church apostle, Reed Smoot, to the U.S. Senate. The hearings over his election offered the concealment expose drama on a grand stage. Before the Senate committee came a disillusioned former professor at Brigham Young Academy to rehearse the temple's notorious vengeance oath for the gathered senators to judge. Had Senator Smoot compromised his national loyalty because of his Mormon temple vows? Church President Joseph F. Smith, nephew of the founding prophet, took the stand to answer for the church. One senator pressed, quote, "Suppose you should receive a divine revelation commanding your people to do something forbidden by the law of the land. Which would it be their duty to obey?" The politically savvy church president fired back, quote, "They would be at liberty to obey just which they pleased. There is absolutely no compulsion." Both sides had learned the script and knew their lines. 1919. The National Reform Association had helped lead the anti-polygamy crusade, though its main goal, as stated by the association, was a constitutional amendment declaring the nation an explicitly Christian one. Even after the polygamy concession, though, NRA leaders charged that Mormonism still threatened the nation. For several years, NRA polemicists crossed swords with the Mormons' bright young thing, Apostle James E. Talmage, who was among the first Mormons to receive the PhD, had earned an academic reputation as a geologist, and had become the faith's gentleman theologian. In 1912, he had published The House of the Lord, which offered the most complete descriptions of Mormon temple worship to date. But the book had been prompted by a scandal. Antagonists had threatened to publish surreptitiously taken photos of the Salt Lake Temple interior unless paid a hefty ransom by Mormon leaders. Talmage suggested preemptive publication of temple images and was tasked with writing the accompanying text. This is, if you live in a place where a new Mormon temple is built, there's now tours for non-Mormons to go through. That's a direct result of this kind of dawning sense of a kind of a proactive public affairs kind of sensitivity about temples. The resulting back and forth from his text, though, came to a head in 1919 when Talmage audaciously showed up at the third NRA World Conference in Pittsburgh. He was eventually allowed to speak to the association for 5 minutes amidst a hail of hisses. But the speaker following suggested he be stripped to reveal his temple undergarments, bearing the marks of his, quote, treasonous oaths. The crowd hemmed him in for an hour before he was able to slip away. 1982. Since World War II, Mormon numbers had swelled such that Protestant evangelicals had noticed. Moreover, the church announced its newfound growth and confidence in dramatic fashion with the 1974 dedication of its temple just north of the nation's capital. Situated rather conspicuously on the Maryland Beltway, the temple mimicked the Salt Lake Temple, but with a shiny, modern, and some said gaudy update that many saw as an unmistakable assertion of power and presence. Surging LDS political conservatism did Mormonism no favors, though, with Protestant evangelicals, who responded to Mormon growth with an invigorated counter-cult movement that targeted the Latter-day Saints in particular. Energetic ex-Mormons produced a book and movie combo in this particular moment, The Godmakers, which became a touchstone for evangelical opposition. The film, complete with spooky music and wonky animated segments, was condemned by the Anti-Defamation League and the National Council of Christians and Jews, but its effects were substantial. The film builds predictably to reenactments of the LDS temple rites. Over the eerie audio effects track, a voice introduces viewers to the secrets. Quote, "What you are seeing is an authentic, first-hand, ever-on-film reenactment of the secret Mormon temple ceremonies." 2009. Basking in the glow of the so-called Mormon Olympics in 2002, many Latter-day Saints took on the swagger of an acceptable American faith. The 2008 election cycle and the LDS Church's involvement in California's 2008 marriage equality initiative cured that. Several outlets agreed that HBO's decision to portray the LDS temple ceremony in a 2009 Big Love episode had something to do with the church's California political activism. The episode actually provided some nuance for the right, with Jean Triplehorn's character Barb voicing the comfort that many Mormons associate with temple worship. But the particular selections from the ceremony formed a conspicuous poke in the eye indeed for Mormons as they ran to the Mormons' rawest ritual nerves. 2012. During this most recent Mormon moment, the political ritual played out in new media and on platforms seemingly grander than ever, but it remained a recognizable performance still. In one of the more memorable enactments of the routine, a reporter, after showing clips of ex-Mormons reenacting the by then discontinued penalty oaths, asked for an explanation from an LDS apostle. After being reminded of their discontinuance, the interviewer pressed, "But wouldn't Mr. Romney have taken these vows in the past, before the changes to the ritual?" Quote, "That sounds Masonic, sir. It sounds Masonic." Not long thereafter, and right on cue, and in this recent moment's appropriate media format, just days before the election, progressive blogger Andrew Sullivan posted footage of the entire LDS temple ceremony secretly filmed by an ex-Mormon. The film's subtitle brings us full circle to that worst-kept secret of the 1840s, quote, "Never before seen videos of secret Mormon temple rituals." So in conclusion, secrets, sacred, ritual, expose. I offer these words as a storyline for minority faith in America. A generation ago, narratives of U.S. religion were crafted as tales of pluralism, democratization, and laicization. A rowdy but lovable marketplace of individual making spiritual choices. The history recounted here adds to a generational chorus of dissent from those depictions. On the one hand, this is a story of the Americanization of Mormonism, of the ways modern political and social worlds have chipped away at its secrets. On the other hand, it's a reminder that the keeping and telling of secrets pushes scholars onto unstable ground. How should one study or narrate what partisans either want to keep hidden as an article of faith or expose as an act of democratic righteousness? Scholars of religion, journalists, and political commentators, it seems to me, might profitably seek that space between taboo and fetish with regard to the secrets. Ideally, we steer clear of both the zealotry of determined secret-keeping and the zealous compulsion to expose. At very least, we must position ourselves so as to better explain what is at stake in the keeping and the exposing across time and in the present. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to continue with the theme of outsider religious candidates from outside of the white Protestant mainstream, and merge that line of inquiry with another kind of more theoretical turn in American religious history recently. For the last several decades, scholars of American religious history have had kind of a definitional crisis, the challenge of defining religion without recourse to metaphysical terms. And it's just over the last few years has occurred to scholars, well, if religion itself is a slippery analytical category, if the definition of religion seems to look different in the United States, for example, than it does in India, or it does in Turkey, it does in Pakistan. Now, what about those categories that are defined in relation to religion? So what about secularism, which is always defined in relation to religion? Is that a mutually constitutive category, therefore not also culturally conditioned, not also variable by time and place? And so I'm taking these two storylines, one about minority religious candidates and one about variations in secularism, and want to talk about Protestant secularism, which I think is the American iteration that matters to me. I was empowered by Janet Jacobson and Ann Pellegrini to question the idea that the secularism that had developed from European and Christian origins was in fact universal and fully separate from Christianity. So I accept as my starting point today the idea that what appears universal in a United States context is actually, and this is Jacobson and Pellegrini's words, constitutes a specifically Protestant form of secularism. So again, I'll refer to that as Protestant secularism. Many scholars of American religious history recently have offered genealogies of this. John Lardis' Modern Secularism in America, 2011, roots this story in the early 19th century. Tracy Fessenden, Culture and Redemption, is a literary historian who charts it from the founding really to the present, this narrative of Protestant secularism. And within Protestant secularism, as scholars such as Fessenden and Modern, Orsi, and others have noted, politicians and others interested in commerce or political stability have tended to distinguish between good and bad religion by how effectively that practitioners within a given tradition honor the boundaries between internal transformation and external action. John Kerry did just this in a 2007 interview for the Pew Religion and Public Life Project, lumping a varied set of practices together and emphasizing that the distinctive work of religion happened within the walls of the individual psyche. And it doesn't have to be a religion per se, Kerry explained. It can be a philosophy, a way of life, Confucianism, Buddhism, Hinduism. There are many different ways in which people choose to have a guiding set of values within their life. And for many it is organized religion, for many it is not. But I will suggest this to you respectfully, that no matter what religion or philosophy, organized or otherwise, people adopt, they almost all have a golden rule within them. And if you're legitimately practicing almost any of them and you're practicing them well, you will tend to be a pretty good citizen and a pretty good person. Adherence, that's Kerry's words, adherence to good traditions may have dogmas of their own in this model, but they translate them into reasonable argument or more universal values when engaging those outside of the tradition. Adherents of bad religion, in contrast, do not register a key change as they switch between these internal and external domains. As Fessenden put it, good religion is good in the measure that it tends toward invisibility, or at least unobtrusiveness, protecting or preserving an ostensibly neutral space in which converted and unconverted, insiders and aliens, may do the work of commerce and governance. So the irony here, and it's not that dramatic, it's pretty predictable, is that outsider candidates in United States history have enthusiastically supported what is essentially a Protestant system. So Catholics, Mormons, Black Protestants have reiterated the same boundaries of Protestant secularism, which don't always serve their religious interests per se. And what I hope to do today is basically to take some of the lessons of Fessenden and Orsi and Modern and others and apply them to the most foundational central actors in our national life, presidential candidates. So these other books that I've been talking about, and scholars tend to write about either do deep, careful readings of literary texts, or tend to work through like hugely abstract analyses of new machinery and new print culture. I'm saying that the story that they're telling about Protestant secularism is clear and revealed in the most highly studied actors in our nation's history, presidential candidates. All I'm doing is taking this narrative and applying it to a different kind of context. And it begins, as almost every narrative of religion and politics does, with Thomas Jefferson in our context. From Thomas Jefferson through the remarkable cluster of outsider religious candidates in the 21st century, Presidential hopefuls have done a disproportionate amount to reinforce Protestant secularism, to some extent ossifying a potentially more fluid concept with laws, memorable rhetoric, policy choices, and precedents. They have fought against any form of religious coercion, have encouraged the faithful to use only reason in public debate, whatever their dogma, have announced equality of opportunity for people of all faiths under a deceptive Protestant shell, and have maintained a remarkably consistent witness that good religion belongs in the individual conscience as an incubator of values. Thomas Jefferson set the pattern for candidates outside of Anglo-American Protestant traditions, though he actually shared more in common with his fellow evangelicals, citizens than most historians are prepared to acknowledge. Jefferson is already, again, the towering figure in nearly every account of church-state relations in the United States, since he did pen some of the most important documents scholars and jurists use to understand the origins of the First Amendment, Statute for Religious Freedom, and the Danbury Letter. But it's not simply semantics to say that Jefferson was also a principal architect of Protestant secularism. The riddle in Jefferson's case is how someone who did not self-identify as a Protestant, certainly a conventional one, could nonetheless give words and legal form to the core conventions generations of Protestants have embraced as their own. Well, the sage of Monticello mocked specific Christian dogmas in his public and private writings and was unremitting in his hostility to Calvinist and Roman Catholic priestcraft, he called it, leading many scholars to characterize Jefferson as somehow more secular or modern than his peers. While he was certainly no Orthodox Christian, Jefferson was nonetheless an early adherent to Scottish common sense philosophy and therefore anticipated the epistemological posture of early 19th century evangelicals. This is particularly meaningful read against Modern's work, who has this work happening in the 18th century instead of 30, 40 years earlier. Jefferson did trace a very similar route to what Modern calls evangelical secularism, several decades before the protagonists in Modern's account did so, and without the additional stimuli of a bewildering world of new machines. On matters of morality, Jefferson accepted the idea of a moral sense, as much a part of a man as his leg or his arm, he said, through which any individual could discern fundamental, self-evident moral truths. Similarly, on matters of religion, distinguished from morality by its truth claims about natural philosophy, Jefferson depicted reason as a divinely appointed tool with which any individual could evaluate theological propositions. Jefferson's confidence in his fellow citizens' ability to use reason to unseat all false gods, and, this is key, I think, to enshrine true religion, had enormous implications for the relationship of the religious and the secular as constituted in the United States. As evangelicals would do later in the 19th century, he advocated what we now conceive of as secularism. I'm thinking of like Baird and the voluntary principle, not to destroy Christianity, but instead to protect the liberty of the individual to exercise his or her reason to discover nature's God. In an elegant and insightful sidestep around the explosive debate of the meaning of Jefferson's wall of separation metaphor, Johann Nehm has recently offered a persuasive reinterpretation of the Danbury Letter, explaining the subtle distinction between protecting free thought for its own sake and for the sake of facilitating the spread of true or good religion. Jefferson believed that by erecting a wall between church and state, Nehm has suggested, he could protect free inquiry, and by doing so, aid the process by which a purified Christianity housed in reason rather than faith would become America's civil religion. For Nehm, the operative sentence in the Danbury Letter actually follows the famous wall image. When Jefferson offered the hope that, quote, adhering to this expression of the supreme will of the nation in behalf of the rights of conscience, I shall see with sincere satisfaction the progress of those sentiments which tend to restore to man all his natural rights, convinced he has no natural right in opposition to his social duties. Here Jefferson verbalized a central tenet of the American version of secularism, that truly free minds will discover only such religious sentiments as will render them more useful as citizens. As a political candidate, sitting president, and retired senior statesman, Jefferson left plenty of evidence of his obsession with crafting a response to Christianity that both conformed to reason and inculcated good citizenship. His opponents in the election of 1800, including many New England Congregationalists, had seized upon Jefferson's published remarks in the Notes on the State of Virginia to argue that the candidate was dangerously indifferent to the maintenance of Protestant Christianity as the de facto national religion. In fact, Jefferson had used rather strong language to make his point that, quote, the legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, almost taunting supporters of state-sponsored religious establishments that, quote, it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no gods. Well, after the election, Jefferson was both personally smarting from this criticism and also eager to find common ground among cantankerous political parties that had only just emerged. So this is not only the context for the Danbury Letter, but it's also the context in which he set about for himself in private to answer how far reason could take him towards a Christianity that was taught then by Protestant divines. So he works up the syllabus of the merits of the doctrines of Jesus, which he mails to Benjamin Rush in 1803, confessing in his cover letter to Rush to be a Christian, quote, in the only sense Jesus wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others, ascribing to himself every human excellence and believing he never claimed any other. Over the following years, he cut and pasted extracts from the Gospels in 4 languages to make the philosophy of Jesus a little-known predecessor to the more robust Jefferson Bible. Jefferson was clearly invested in discovering a way of approaching religion that would not lead to sectarian conflict in government. While there is more to say about Jefferson, the essential insight here is that he personally endorsed and lent his pen to support a version of secularism that was anything but neutral. Instead, he protected space for and endeavored to make normative particular kinds of Protestant religious activity, including engagement with texts and emphasis on an inner transformation and voluntary association in communities of the faithful. Moreover, Jefferson strove to make reasonableness a gauge of good or permissible religion and struck out violently against any attempts, even private ones, to constrain another's conscience. In a September 1800 letter to Rush, Jefferson laid out this proposition most clearly, pledging to use all of his power if elected president to fight against attempts to introduce a religious establishment. He said it better, of course. He said, I have sworn upon the altar of God eternal hostility against every form of tyranny over the mind of man. When subsequent candidates have found themselves in Jefferson's shoes as members or representatives of minority religious traditions in an overwhelmingly Protestant country, they have followed his pattern of advocating for space at the table in a way that actually entrenches Protestant interests in this version of Protestant secularism. John Kerry, Mitt Romney, and Barack Obama, 3 recent candidates from this century operating outside of white Protestant traditions, have affirmed using strikingly parallel language the Protestant secularism embedded in American law and culture. They've used a bully pulpit, or at least their relatively privileged spots on the campaign trail in a 24-hour media cycle, to define good religion in Jeffersonian terms as that which produces internal transformation, involves only voluntary association, is consistent with reason, and is not presumed to enforce any distinctive moral code. Under fire or suspicion from Protestant voters, white Protestant voters, I should say, Kerry, Romney, and Obama have each delivered at least one landmark religion speech, billed as such, delivered as such, and analyzed as such, in which they have described using rather precise terms religion as a private exchange which translates into politics primarily by expanding the believer's sense of the public good. Moreover, they have offered nearly identical definitions of good and bad religions, which are slightly more capacious than Jefferson's, but really congruent in terms of their thought process. Kerry addressed, and we'll definitely do Kerry, depending on time, we'll do Romney, no Obama today. Kerry addressed his religious commitments most directly on October 24, 2004, at a time when he and George W. Bush were deadlocked in the polls at 49% each. He chose to give his speech in Broward County, Florida, ground zero for the Democrats' defeat in the 2000 election, in a site of immense symbolic significance, and on Sunday, no less. The Democratic nominee walked a delicate tightrope, quoting Scripture repeatedly, but underscoring at every turn that his distinctive religious experience was only internal, and that more profound impulses towards the common good were the only external marker of his faith. He prayed and wrestled with Catholicism during the Vietnam War, he said, but was ultimately able to affirm it, resulting in a, quote, sense of hope and a belief in a higher purpose. At the rhetorical center of his address, Kerry quoted from the book of James, saying, "It is not enough, my brother, to say you have faith when there are no deeds. Faith without works is dead." Kerry used this verse as the great pivot from private experience to public action. For me, he went on, that means having and holding to a vision of a society of the common good where individual rights and freedoms are connected to our responsibility to others. It means understanding that the authentic role of leadership is to advance the liberty of each of us and the good that can come to all of us when we work together as one united community. While Kennedy had largely dispelled Protestant concerns that a Roman Catholic president would bow to Vatican influence in American politics decades before, Kerry felt compelled to revisit the issue. As he interpreted it, Roman Catholics were obliged to live moral lives, but not to attempt to enact on others the specific policy positions advocated by their church leaders. Reminding of his auditors of the communion controversy that had committed so much ink over the summer. This is when bishops debated whether or not they should bar Kerry from communion. Ultimately, the College of Bishops decided no, but several local bishops, 3, maybe 4, had decided that they would bar Kerry until he repented of his pro-choice positions. He said, quote, "I know there are some bishops who have suggested that as a public official, I must cast votes or take public positions on issues like a woman's right to choose or stem cell research that carry out the tenets of the Catholic Church. But then, trying scrupulously to adhere to these boundaries of good religion by refusing to constrain another's conscience, Carey demurred. I love my church. I respect the bishops, but I respectfully disagree." He continued, "My task as I see it is not to write every doctrine into law. That is not right nor possible in a pluralistic society." Carey and some reinforced the Protestant secularism that had characterized American presidential politics since Jefferson. Republicans, too, nominated a candidate from outside the traditional Protestant fold when they put Mitt Romney up for the highest office in 2012. Romney would revisit his faith several times during the campaign, so he's not completely silent, but he had made a signature statement earlier during the Republican primary 4 years previous. Facing a primary field that included Mike Huckabee, an outspoken Baptist, Romney attempted to lay to rest concerns about his membership in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This is in December 2007. He did so not by defending Mormonism per se. Indeed, he did. So you're right. He refused to address what he called his church's distinctive doctrines. Won't talk about it. But he did reaffirm a model of Protestant secularism and firmly placed the Latter-day Saints in the category of good religions. Romney used different personal anecdotes than Carey did, but otherwise echoed very closely all the lines of the Broward County speech. Inverting Carey's sequencing, Romney led off his discussion of faith by assuring the American people that he would never allow religious authorities to dictate policy positions. No listener missed the homage to Kennedy's 1960 speech. "Let me assure you," he leveled, "that no authorities of my church, or of any other church for that matter, will ever exert influence on presidential decisions. Their authority is theirs within the province of church affairs, and it ends where the affairs of the nation begin." Romney further vowed that he would guard against any legislation rooted too closely in the distinctive doctrines of any one tradition. "I will put no doctrine of any church above the plain duties of the office and the sovereign authority of the law," he promised. Romney continued, "Every religion has its own unique doctrines and history. Well, these are not basis for criticism, but rather a test of our tolerance." He returned verbatim to Carey's script at this point, almost verbatim. It really is kind of startling, proclaiming the primary purpose of faith was enlarging believers' sense of the common good and welcoming within the fold of good religion all those traditions willing to forbear from advancing doctrinal particularities through the ballot box. "I believe that every faith I have encountered draws its adherents closer to God," Romney declared, before cataloging what he thought were the most winsome features of, in order, Catholicism, evangelicalism, Lutheranism, Judaism, and Islam. It is important to recognize that while differences in theology exist between the churches in America, we share a common creed of moral convictions, he assured listeners. And that where the affairs of our nation are concerned, it's usually a sound rule to focus on the latter, on the great moral principles that urge us all on a common course. So the intention of this brief conversation today is not to theorize new ways of understanding church-state relations, but merely to observe how faithfully presidential candidates, those at the very center of our national life and the most prominent actors in our shared experience as citizens, have inscribed and reinscribed the boundaries of Protestant secularism. And to note the irony that those outside of white Protestant traditions have defended those boundaries just as energetically. Thank you.
At this time, I would like to open up the floor for a couple people to ask questions. I also just want to remind you that all of our speakers will be here for the entirety of the day, and I'm volunteering them, but I'm certain that they are willing to talk with you during the breaks, before and after, if you have questions that you don't get a chance to ask during this formal time. And also, just a quick note, if you would like to ask a question, we have a couple of guys here who have microphones. Please allow the microphone to come to you and ask your question into the microphone so that we can all hear you and so that the recording can also pick you up. So does anyone would like to start with a question? Got one over here.
Hi. Just a question for Kate, which I thought was a fascinating paper. And you touched on some of the things that the people you looked at left out of their view of history. Unless I missed it in the talk, they left out the First Amendment and the religious freedom clauses, which makes a lot of sense because it's a tricky thing today to deal with. But they also left out the Great Awakening, which would seem to fit in with their version of history quite neatly. And then a quick follow-up: Do these books, do these thinkers today, or these people who are looking at the founding era, do they, and into the colonial era, do they grapple with the problem of theocracy, which is something that people in the colonial era thought about? The Pilgrims and Puritans certainly do, but it's something that's very prevalent in the political thought from the Reformation through into the 17th and 18th centuries.
Thank you. Those are great questions. For the First Great Awakening, that actually just got left on the cutting room floor. Yes, absolutely. The First Great Awakening is a central moment for these thinkers, and especially George Whitefield, because if the goal is to find particular men who exemplify the process, George Whitefield can play that role as the great evangelist. There's actually been some very recent public conversation where some conservative pundits have argued so George Whitefield is America's spiritual founding father, to use the title of a recent book, and that he should be elevated to a particularly high level, and including attributing to George Whitefield the concept of the new birth, which obviously far predates George Whitefield. Some evangelical historians have come out and pushed back on that a little bit. But yes, the Great Awakening and Whitefield are seen as absolutely central events. In terms of the question of theocracy and the First Amendment, no, those are questions that are not discussed with any significant depth. And I think it's because of the focus on principle. So if liberty is the principle of the founding era, it is embodied in the First Amendment, it's right? And then we apply it to subsequent moments. So the complexities that might come out of what the First Amendment, the process of creating the First Amendment, different readings of the First Amendment, those are mostly addressed within kind of a culture wars context. And the culture wars context is usually a little bit off to the side of this discussion because it's so admittedly political. So it's not centrally problematized.
Hi. I have two questions, one for Kate and one for Spencer. Okay. My first question to Kate is the link between, I'm very interested in this link between Moses or the ancient Israelites and the Mayflower Compact. And I'd just like you to speak a little bit more about how they linked them. I'd be curious to just a little bit more on, I don't know if you know this, I don't know how much you read into it, but how exactly they justified that link. A little more specifically, I'd be curious. And then for Spencer, you talked about the colonization of Mormons, and it makes a lot of sense given their oppressed status, their history of oppression. Do they still, I'm curious as to how has that dialogue changed as they're attempting to become the American religion, and how they talk about the oppression in the past and then somehow becoming more of this all-American sort of part of the mainstream and trying to be included sort of in that Protestant mainstream. Can you speak to that a little bit?
On the issue of Moses and the Mayflower Compact, the immediate political context of this, for those who might not know, is that the Texas State Board of Education standards for 2010, which are now leading to textbooks, which Mark Chancey will be talking about later this afternoon, require the connecting of Moses as sort of an original thinker for the creation of the United States. And so this is something that Texas teachers are grappling with right now, of how to put Moses into a process that, by any reading, he was at least very distant from. So the connecting happens in part through the Mayflower Compact, and it happens in two ways. One is that if Moses is seen as a lawgiver, and the Mayflower Compact is seen as an original law that creates a union, so law then goes to foundational constitution and then is connected to our Constitution. So the process is through that, and not actually through any of the specific content of any of those documents. The Mayflower Compact doesn't hold up to that kind of scrutiny if you look at its actual text. So it has to be a description of the document rather than an examination of the document. The other way that this happens, I think, is through the internally referential nature of this conversation about faith in the founding, and that's that the same documents appear over and over and over. And if you dig into the footnotes, and many of these books are very well footnoted, if you dig into the footnotes, they refer back to each other consistently and never to an outside academic scholarly discussion of the context of the creation of the Mayflower Compact, for instance, because they're avoiding any of the reading that would look at that more plotting narrative. And so for people who are steeped in this reading of the American founding, and it's reiterated regularly in sermons and in any number of contexts, there is a self-evident connection between Moses, the Mayflower Compact, the Declaration of Independence, and the Constitution. And the different moments of their creation really isn't even relevant. Right? So it's just through repetition, I think, is the primary way. Spencer?
On mine, very briefly, I mean, it could be a long response, but just a kind of brief one is that it's a tension-filled modern identity for Mormons given their history. In part, this history, this sense of kind of persecution in the past is tightly woven into modern Mormon identity, such that they kind of expect to be misrepresented or misunderstood in public. Something like the Book of Mormon musical to them is just an eye roll of here we go again, snappier tunes, but it's the same old lyrics. And they expect mockery and so on. That fits with a kind of representation of the past. And it might be in a kind of rhizomatic way in modern Mormon political conservatism, this memory of it becomes kind of Western in a way too, though. Distant federal power, heavy-handed for us here, our own ways. Being so that's kind of there, but they have to be very careful with that because too long into that story, and it's about polygamy, and that doesn't work very well because it ends up sounding a bit like a defense of polygamy, which mainstream Latter-day Saints have no interest in. They've been running from polygamy for over 100 years, so they're good at that kind of flight as well. Complicated. The end.
I want to keep us on time for the rest of the day. So again, I encourage you, as we take a short break here between panels, find our panelists, ask a question if you have one for them. But in this short break here, feel free to get a little more to eat or drink, or to find the restrooms are out the door and to the left. And we'll convene here in just a few minutes for our second panel. Thank you.
Next, a discussion about the